going to invite that gentleman, sorry, Jennifer, whose name is Saleem Ali, and he is the Distinguished Professor of Geography and member of UN International Resource Panel at the University of Delaware, to give a presentation on migration and minerals. And then we'll follow that with some questions and answers.
Okay, it's that time of the day when clearly you're all exhausted. Last thing you want to have is a long lecture, so I'm going to really adapt and have more time for you to ask questions. From the time I've been here, it's clear that there's a lot of interest in the work that's happening at the international level. So I would say that my presentation is wearing my hat as a member of the United Nations International Resource Panel. And since there's been also the theme of the SDGs, which are also under the umbrella of the United Nations, perhaps what I'll try to do rather than go through this PowerPoint is I'm just going to identify a couple of key features of what we have been doing at the UN related to natural resources and broader issues of social responsibility. So the UN has a series of these panels that you're probably familiar with. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is the most well-known one, which has over 500 people on it, scientists. And that panel is focused on informing member states around climate change science. We also have a smaller panel, which is the International Resource Panel, that is only 40 people. And this is focused on broad issues of natural resource security, and it informs UN member states about what are some of the key challenges coming up in terms of resource abundance and scarcity, and hence resource security. So one of the interesting features of this panel is that it isn't beholden to one UN treaty. Like the climate change panel is related to the climate change treaty. There's a separate panel on biodiversity. You may have heard of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. That is connected to the UN Convention on Biodiversity. This panel is liberated from all those conventions, and it can deal with whatever issues are on the mind of UN member states. And it has a steering committee, which is comprised of UN member states. And the United States is actually a very active member in this committee, unusually so, because with a lot of UN bodies, the US has taken a withdrawal, like from UNESCO, as you know. So my role on the panel has been a couple of things. I was one of the authors on a report on mineral resource governance, which we did a few years ago. And then most recently, I was the lead author on this report, which is focused on migration and natural resources. Now, you might wonder, what does migration have to do with jewelry, right? Well, it's a story which goes back to the mines themselves, which is basically that mines often involve resource rushes. You know about gold rushes and diamond rushes and so on. So that's one aspect of it. But then also migration itself can have an impact on different resource issues where the migration takes place too. And some of that can be forced migration, and where people are being displaced because of conflict and other issues, and some of that can be voluntary migration as well. So voluntary migration where people are moving for economic prosperity, or their seasonal migrations, which people might do. So we did this global assessment, and I'm not going to go through the slides because of time, but just to know, several people were involved in this, and I don't want to take full credit for this because it was a very long 2-year process, and the report is available. We have been focusing on what would be the various policy options. The goal is ultimately to inform policy options for UN member states. So this is the report. If you want to, here's another QR code. This one you don't have to make a donation for. You can download, which we have happily done, and I'm glad that was done, and I hope it helps the the wonderful initiative that is there in Zimbabwe. But this one is available. It's in all of the UN members, all of the UN international languages. The report is the summary of the report. So the UN languages are English, of course, but also French, and Russian is a UN language. Remember, Russia is one of the permanent members of the Security Council. Spanish, Arabic, and Chinese. So those of you who also work in other countries, you can have a look at that in other languages as well. The full report is almost 200 pages, but there's a summary and there's a policy options bit. The part which is most relevant for our discussion is we did an analysis, very detailed quantitative analysis of what happens when mining rushes happen. You know, like basically when you have a sudden resource rush like Elakaka in Madagascar. Some of you are familiar with what happened there with the sapphire rush. I was in Elakaka when that happened, and it was quite astonishing, you know, and it was not just a domestic migrant rush, but it was also, we have friends who worked in Sri Lanka who will know that there were plenty of Sri Lankans who showed up there too. And when I went, I was surprised to find there were 3 mosques there in Elakaka because of all the Sri Lankan Muslims who had migrated there. So, you know, you get these very unusual phenomena with resource rushes. You get people from all over the world sometimes congregating. So one of the things we found out, and this paper was published in one of the more prestigious journals in science called Nature Communications, where we did a very detailed econometric analysis and looked at what has happened with mineral resource rushes in Africa. And what we found, what was really interesting, and this was especially of interest to the European steering committee members, was wherever you had a migration rush, you had a decrease in external migration to Europe. You know, because Europe right now, as you well know, is very concerned about the boats coming from Africa, right? And of course, sadly, so many people dying in this effort to migrate to Europe. A lot of them coming from sub-Saharan African countries where there have been minerals in various forms. But the interesting finding was that when you have this mineral rush, it actually decreases external migration because everyone wants to go to, it's the honeypot phenomenon. So now we have real empirical evidence to show that actually minerals can prevent external migration and lead to internal migration, which makes sense, but you need to have evidence to actually show it, right? And then we also looked at the fact of what happens then with the internal migration itself in terms of the different kinds of pressures on resources. And there also we found really interesting aspects of what happens whether there is any property rights that those communities have, where they're migrating to. You can have very different resource security impacts, whether or not people have property rights and so on. So it's a very detailed analysis. If you're interested, you can certainly read through it. But that was one of the key aspects of this. This is a model which we developed in another study, which is around, you know, with some of the solutions we're looking for. We call it smart mineral enterprise development, where basically this is not just for jewelry, but for any kind of metal consuming industry, where how do we get good signaling from the demand centers versus the supply centers, and how we can develop public-private partnership models around that. Key is SDG 17 is on partnerships, and we need partnerships. It shouldn't just be a vacuous word which we are using like, yeah, let's all get together in a room and talk through things. Partnerships are very specific in terms of their anatomy, how you structure them, who does what role. And so this is what this tries to show, where, you know, this is the role of the private sector, this is the role of the public sector, and this is where you have the PPP, which is the black marks around it, which is the public-private partnership. I'm not going to go through it because this particular diagram was constructed more for technology metals, but the same could be done for jewelry. But just to give you an example that this is the kind of technique we can use structurally. Now, the report has 10 key messages, which I'm not, again, going to go through because of shortage of time. The goal is to address your questions, and Andrea and I can just sit through and have a quick chat with you a fireside chat kind of thing. But one of the messages I will go through is the refugee camp phenomenon. That, one of the things we looked at was when you have involuntary migration, and this is happening in Myanmar. Of course, that's a country with great concern around gemstones. And a lot of the Rohingya who have been forced out of Myanmar and settled in Bangladesh, what is going to happen in those refugee camps in terms of economic development and resource opportunities? So one positive finding we had was that, contrary to what people might think, that these refugees are going to degrade the land around them. Of course, there's going to be some impact where they have the tents. But what we also found is that they're actually cultivating the land around it. So going back to your example of the agriculture and jewelry, I was wondering when I was hearing Roy talk earlier, I thought maybe the jewelry industry as a way of engagement. How about going to those refugee camps and training those people in jewelry making? And finding a way, these people have been displaced because of the negative impact of the dark economy of jewelry, right? Jade and rubies in Myanmar, who have forced these people out to some degree. People would argue that a lot of this is about resource nationalism in Myanmar, which has forced these people out. Why not help by getting these refugees trained in some skills which can then work with them? And this would be easy to coordinate with the UN High Commission for Refugees. It would be something that could be very welcomed by the Bangladeshi government that is hosting most of the Rohingya. And you could do similarly with the Afghan refugees who are coming to Pakistan, which is my country of origin. We have 3 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan also. And a lot of those people have come from, parts of Afghanistan where there is a history of gemstone mining. And we heard, good news to some degree that there may be some opportunity for the Afghans to be able to trade their gemstones, at least for poverty alleviation, much as we don't want to support the Taliban, but we certainly want to support the local communities in that region. So this could be a nice way for the jewelry industry to engage, and especially those of you who are so committed to this cause. Similarly, one could say in South America, the huge problem with the Venezuelan refugees who have been, the largest involuntary migration in the last 3 years has been the Venezuelan migration to Colombia and other parts. What could be done there, I wonder? And of course, Venezuelan gold is a huge problem for the industry. There's not very good data on it. And so here's another way in which the migration problem you can engage with in a positive way. Okay, so that's just one policy recommendation I put forward. The rest are not relevant to your work, so I'm not going to go through them because this was a very expansive effort. Some of it is on hydropower and migration because that's one of the largest sources of migration too, is when you're building dams and so on. Then we went through very carefully. We didn't want this to be one of those UN reports which is hard to operationalize. We went through also different policies that you can take into, like, how do you do restoration? We came up with ideas around, like, green remittance bonds is one example of migration policies where you have voluntary migration. How can you get people who have migrated overseas to contribute towards local economic development? And the government of the Philippines has come up with a really interesting idea of having green remittance bonds, where you give people that incentive to, when they're sending remittances, they can invest in bonds which will be used, and they will accrue a return of some kind, but they'll be used for restoration projects in their countries of origin. So that's it. I'm going to just stop there so that we can have a chat, and you don't feel that this darkness in the room is going to be overwhelming. So maybe we put the lights on, and then Andrea and I can have a quick chat with you. First, maybe, Andrea, if you have a question or two, and then we'll just engage with the broader audience.
Find the panel questions and that.
Oh, okay, yep, sure.
I'll bring you another mic. We'll also engage questions from the audience at this time, so we'll do both.
Yeah. And you're welcome to ask me, also one of my other roles is I've just recently been appointed by the UN Secretary General on a new panel. It's called an advisory board on zero waste. And so we're focusing on the circular economy particularly. So that's another area that is of great interest to the UN system currently, is how to move towards what is in the SDG lexicon. SDG 12 is responsible production and consumption, which is focused on the circular economy as well. So, all right.
I'm just looking to see if there are any, sometimes people are jumping up and down in their seats to ask a question. Will is, Elizabeth is on her way to you.
Rockin'. I had a question I didn't even know I had, so this is exciting. I guess when I think of migration, whether involuntary or not, I think of large groups of people needing lots of resources or systems to be set up or places to live and food and things, supports. When that is internal inside of a country or a region, how does the UN usually respond to that? Or what kind of exterior supports are there for that?
Yes, so, with any kind of crisis migration, there's a donor fund which is set up ad hoc, and countries are asked to donate to it. And so this is the challenge we have is right now, because of the Ukraine conflict, so much of the resources have been sapped towards it, enormous amounts of resources that it's very difficult to actually get support for many other crises. People have been saying that we need to develop some kind of separate UN crisis fund around specific issues like adaptation, climate adaptation. So there has been at the last climate COP, as we call it, the Conference of the Parties, the last meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, there was an agreement to set up a crisis fund related to extreme weather events. So if a country has a sudden, hurricane and so on, that there would be a separate fund which cannot be taken out without a proper process. And so that's how it's happening. But otherwise, it's all ad hoc, and it's very tricky. Some countries, the usual players, the donors who are willing to, the Europeans, the Americans, the Canadians, Australians, the Japanese have been very generous in terms of their UN contributions. It's quite remarkable, actually, from an academic perspective. The Japanese have given the single biggest donation to the UN for learning. They endowed the United Nations University with a $100 million endowment in the 1970s, and there's still support. Most of the United Nations University budget is supported by the Japanese. So,
Didn't know that.
yeah. Others? Yes. Yep. Would you like?
Oh, Mark's got his hand up. I'm more interested in your questions at this point than mine. No, Elizabeth is right there. Hand him the mic, Elizabeth. Don't let him get away with it.
I'm not very talkative. All right. A little off this specific topic, Saleem, but to your book, there's a very interesting premise in your book about comparing the gold standard and the environmental impacts of the price and the various rushes attending to those types of movement of people towards the gold and the environmental impact. So I'd love to hear a couple of minutes about that.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Yeah, so Mark is referring to one of my earlier books titled Earthly Order, How Natural Laws Define Human Life, which was published last year with Oxford University Press. In that, I have a section on, it's divided into three parts. Natural order, which has a lot of physics and chemistry and so on, but accessible, not too difficult. And the second part is social and economic order. In the social and economic order section, I talk a little bit about gold as a way of connecting natural constraints to the economic system. So the gold order, the gold standard, basically created this limitation on consumption, which a lot of environmentalists argue for, right? A lot of the environmentalists' concern about growth, economic growth, is that we are now just printing money at times and causing inflation and so on too, but also we are creating wealth when we do not have the natural resource base to support it. And the gold standard had, in essence, prevented that when it existed. So what I tried to argue in the book in that section is that we may want to think about, that's not to say we need to bring back the gold standard in all its form, but we need to think about how natural resource constraints can be linked to economic order in just the way that the gold standard was bringing forth. Now, there is also another aspect to this, which is around, we have now so much gold lying in reserves, right? So there is also this other contentious issue about, do we need gold mining or not, because we have all this gold reserve, and because we don't have the gold standard, should there be some controlled release of that gold to meet gold demand, right? Now, of course, the biggest problem with that would be the livelihood issue for the miners. But from a purely environmental point of view, if you look at it from an industrial ecology perspective, that makes a lot of sense, because gold is eminently recyclable, and you've got so much of it above ground lying in these reserves. And actually, there are calculations which have been done. It's quite astonishing. Most of the world's gold known reserves is above ground compared to below ground, right? In terms of economically viable reserves, not resources. We're the difference between reserve and resources in economic geology. So, so that can be another motivation for thinking about gold supply in the long run, in terms of if we can deal with the livelihood problem, then it becomes more questionable about how much gold mining is needed. And this goes back to, you had Lisa Levin, I heard you had here yesterday talking about deep sea mining. Her argument is similar about, we shouldn't be taking out minerals from the deep sea when we have other minerals above ground and so on. It's the same logic of the argument. And as a systems scientist, I try to think about what are all these different connections. For me, it's the livelihoods are just as important. So even though that may come at some environmental cost, unless we find an alternative for those people's livelihoods, we probably should still continue to have some level of mining and do it more responsibly.
You all think you're loud when you're yelling, but you're not. You're just not.
Hi, thank you so much. Christina Mull from Ethical Metalsmiths, and we met at University of Delaware a few years back, and I've been following some of your work, especially around the rare earth and strategic metals, so it's a little bit of a segue question, but I saw in the New York Times about a month ago, I think it was a campaign initiated from World Wildlife Fund, or one of the environmental NGOs, asking banks and large financial institutions not to finance any activity around deep sea mining. And I've been wondering for such a long time, where do you, and since you see these ecosystems of how the world, metals and minerals are moving around the world, do you see that pressure ever coming to bear on gold and other precious metals? Like, where is the bank and the international finance community? Why don't they ever show up and participate in these conversations? And do you think they feel any leverage from, or what would push them? What would create some leverage for them to engage like this?
Yes, no, thank you. Great question there, with reference to deep sea mining, my involvement in that has also been with my United Nations hat to some degree, because the International Seabed Authority is a UN entity. And that was tasked under the UN Law of the Sea Convention to regulate deep sea mining. Now, keep in mind, we do not have an international governance system for terrestrial mining, right? There's no global treaty on mining. But we do have one on deep sea mining, which is unusual, even though it hasn't even started yet. So now I believe Susan said that she asked Lisa to focus more on the coastal mining for gold potentially in Papua New Guinea. Now that's very different from international waters mining, right? Because the coastal mining comes under national laws. But most of the conversation currently about deep sea mining, all this activism that you're seeing, is about international seabed authority mining in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which is this region between Hawaii and Mexico, that area where there are a lot of these nodules. That's the first area that's likely to be mined. Now, the other aspect of the UN's interest is, because under that International Seabed Authority, you can have any member state of the UN who's a signatory to the convention sponsor a company to go in. No private company can go on its own and do deep sea mining. It has to have a state sponsor. And so this has given small island countries like Nauru, Kiribati, Tonga an opportunity for potentially having alternative economic development without having negative externalities on land. And that's why you have the 3 countries who are sponsoring deep sea mining currently are these 3 small island states that are moving forward. But there are others. I mean, there's Belgium and others also who are involved too. So the activism against deep sea mining I find very interesting. And as someone who studies environmental conflicts, I find it similar to anti-nuclear activism, which at one level troubles me because it's not often science-based activism. It's fear-based activism. Now, fear-based activism is fine. Everyone has a right to it. You know, so social perception of risk is any community's prerogative. If you feel that one risk is more, so who are we to tell you it isn't? But here it's not about individual risk to oneself, but potentially looking at trade-offs, which we are often as system scientists we have to think about. So you brought up, like with terrestrial mining, if we don't get nickel from deep sea mining, the question I would ask is, will that mean will we be mining more nickel in Indonesia using high pressure acid leaching, which is going to negatively impact the coral triangle? That is one of the most high biodiversity areas in the world by far. That's the more intriguing question for me. And unfortunately, the activists don't look at it that way, because right now they're in mission mode. They're like, we need to stop it. And that's the same with the nuclear activism. It's not about like, what's the other story? It's like, we have to stop it. And so and this is true of not just WWF, it has become true of some scientists who have very specific areas, and they're brilliant scientists, but they have very specific areas like the marine system. So you have Amazon scientists who are concerned about the Amazon. For me, what's interesting is at the planetary level, how do you compare those impacts? And we have to make some tough choices, unfortunately. You know, and that's the part which I find, with nuclear, the same thing happened, and unfortunately we shot ourselves in the foot because we were not willing to make those choices. And then, you know, you got dependent on Putin for gas, you got other things, where now even the environmental activists would agree, most of them, that extending the life of nuclear power plants, current nuclear power plants, the new ones is a different story, which one can argue with the science on, but that would have been the best transition option. Even California has had to recognize that, right? They've had to extend the life of Diablo Canyon. Germany blundered through that now, and they're having to figure it out, and they still haven't figured it out, really, to be honest. So this is my concern. I really fear that we are not having a systems approach to the activism. And, you know, like BMW or these companies coming up and saying, oh, we are not going to source minerals from this, that, and the other, it's of no consequence because there's no mining right now. They get brownie points with the activists and they don't have to do anything. You know, so I don't read much into that. But as someone who has always, I've served on the board of environmental groups, I have supported them, I am concerned about the direction activism is taking. And it is very well resourced now. You know, you have some of the Silicon Valley tycoons who are giving so much money to some of the activist groups that they are being driven by a certain agenda many times. And there's a really good book actually published by a Yale professor on it. It's called Billionaire Wilderness. And it's about this rapid influx of philanthropy that's gone into. I mean, Jeff Bezos has given $100 million to the Environmental Defense Fund, to WRI, you know, huge levels, the same endowment amount as the Japanese are giving to the UN university. So, you know, when you have that amount of resources, it can distort many times the actual outcome. And that's what concerns me. I don't want to be pro or anti. I just want to follow the science and see where does that take us.
You're asking everyone to learn to think differently, though, because a system scientist's approach is very different than a specialist. So when you get a student in your classroom
Yes.
and they've not been exposed to systems thinking, what's the advice you give them? What's the thing you challenge your new students with so that they can learn to think like a systems scientist?
So one of the things I say to them is that as a systems scientist, you have to embrace suboptimality. Suboptimality, does anyone or everyone know what that would mean? That means you have to accept that you will never have perfection. That, so for environmentalists, that's very difficult because environmentalism by definition is a utopian ideology. It's like, there was a great world, we have to get to it. It's very much that. And my heart is with that, really, and I've taught environmental studies for past 20 years. But from a practical point of view, it becomes very frustrating. And that's why you get this kind of green rage phenomenon. You get, Greta Thunberg and others who are well-intentioned, young people with great energy. And I met her in Madrid at the COP meeting there, and it's wonderful to see it. But at the other level, I'm like, oh goodness, that energy, like how can you channel it in a more pragmatic way? So I always say, get to that understand. Suboptimality is our destiny. We will not be able to reach perfection at every level. And this has been mathematically proven. The economist Amartya Sen, who won a Nobel Prize in economics for also his work on famine, and he worked a lot in developing countries. He wrote a paper many years ago, it was called The Impossibility of a Paretian Liberal, where he said basically that in any liberal society also, it's impossible to get Pareto optimality. Pareto optimal is an economic term, goes back to this economist Pareto. You might have seen people who look at like, how do you find the most efficient outcome? Economists try to, it's not possible in a liberal society, meaning what do you mean by a liberal society? Where different people have different preferences, right? You can try to educate, you can try to make some changes in terms of choice, but you will never be able to, if you really want a truly liberal society, you will never be able to get optimality because people are going to exercise their choices at some level. So that's really the huge challenge we face. That's how I get to that.
And I was looking at your faces when he said it because it's a really hard concept to wrap your mind around, and then you have to decide if you're going to accept it.
Can I ask a question?
One more question.
Just directly on that. When you said suboptimal and we all went, oh, what does that mean? For this group, could you give an example of, as all the things you've been listening, can you tell us what would suboptimal look like for us?
Like if you want to have like, this is, what would be the optimal outcome that you want for any kind of choice you want to make, like you're a family, right? And you want to make everyone happy. What would be, is there a way to get an optimal outcome to make everyone happy? Like, where do you want to go for a vacation? Is there an optimal outcome, potentially? What I am saying is if you have a small number of people, it's still possible. But when you have more than a certain number, someone will have to compromise. That's what suboptimality is. Suboptimality means someone has to compromise. You will never get perfection to make everyone as happy as they want to be, right? So that is really hard for people to accept because that ability to where do we compromise? And then we come up with these psychological traps, like one of the worst ones is the slippery slope argument, right? Because then people start using slippery slopes and, oh, we will never compromise. If we compromise there, then everything will be compromised. And the slippery slope argument has been one of the biggest sources of conflict in the world because we use it all the time. Liberals use it and both sides of the political spectrum use it. And it's become a hindrance to any kind of cooperative mechanism. So I hope that explains suboptimality. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I mean, with jewelers, I think, like, for example, I would say social versus environmental, right? They are not always compatible. Many times, to get to the better social outcome, you have to compromise on the environmental. I mean, just like with deep sea mining, I was saying, deep sea mining, in many cases, you have no child labor, you don't have any of the other issues, but there will probably be maybe unknown biodiversity impacts in the abyssal plain. So there it is. So someone will have to figure out within the jewelry industry, if you ever get into gold mining around that, okay, which part is it that we want to prioritize, you know? With cobalt and Congo, you know, we had this book come out, Cobalt Red. I don't know if you heard about that. Now that book, it's a very powerful book, but you know, why did it sell so many copies? Because Joe Rogan had the guy on his podcast with 11 million immediate audience, right? Now, why would Joe Rogan want to have this guy? He wasn't interested as much in Congo. Why was it? It's an easy target for saying electrical vehicles are bad.
Which
Right?
supported his philosophy.
Exactly. And that's how it was completely marketed. Now, this well-intentioned activist Siddharth Kara didn't think that was going to be, you know. But there's the suboptimality. Yes, of course, electric cars, DRC, challenge, cobalt, yes, there will be a transition period. Probably they will be suffering, but there will also be development. We have to navigate, we have to negotiate, we have to keep working with it. But we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So.
Other examples might be, we get some suboptimality when people want to argue about whether craft code's good enough or not good enough. That would be an example. It's like, I've heard some arguments around it with Fairminds credits program. Oh, you know, carbon offsets don't work, so the credit programs, well, but is it a step in the right direction? Where's the compromise? So those would be some immediate examples in this room. Any other questions? All ready to start looking at the way you're thinking?
Yeah, but I mean, I think the jewelry industry, the other thing that I find with the environmentalists, and this I'm trying to get my students to think about it, you know, there is this kind of minimalism around a lot of like, why are we buying things we don't need, right? And often with jewelry, that's the first thing. My students come up to me and they're like, but I feel guilty buying jewelry. And then I have to give them that same systems approach. I said, you shouldn't feel guilty. You are contributing to development in ways which you know, this is absolutely not something that you should feel, you know, very, as long as you try to do your homework and figuring it out. But this is the other thing the jewelry industry has to be very watchful of, is that, you know, we're talking about the messaging and looking at what people are saying. This kind of minimalism is also a concern because, again, it's not the systems perspective. I used to teach at the University of Vermont for 10 years, and I know there are a couple of Vermont-based friends, right? Now at UVM, you know, Vermont, we had faculty, like one of my faculty who had wedding reception for their daughter, and everything was locally grown. Like, okay, the wheat had to be from Vermont, which went into the bread to do this. And we're like, for heaven's sake, you know, there's a limit to this. So what if you're helping some Ukrainian farmer, you're getting the wheat from there? So what if there's a little bit of a carbon footprint that comes with it? Because we are part of the same planet. We wouldn't be, and you try, so you have to calibrate accordingly a little bit in terms of where, yes, get local in certain cases. I go to the farmer's market, but don't obsess over it to the point where you think that, you know, any kind of external aspect is, think about it at a planetary level. So this is the other thing you have to be watchful of in industry is think about, you know, how to make sure people don't go into that sense of like, you don't need it, you shouldn't buy it, you know. Someone else needs it down the supply chain. And that messaging is not getting through to a lot of our younger generation now.
So can I ask one more?
Yeah.
One more.
Okay. So I'm Christina Miller, and Saleem and I have met through an organization called Amazon Aid. Some of you have seen the film River of Gold. It showed here at the conference a few years ago. But in that work, one of the challenges that feels immense and confusing is, on one hand, we do have an ability to cooperate with each other and coordinate and work toward agreements. And in environments like that, you have the wild card of corruption that goes from the very top to the very bottom, and you have illicit activity that is, you know, results in the murder of journalists. And this is at the edge of our industry where we work so hard sometimes criticizing each other about, is the standard doing enough or is that doing enough? And really we have this thing here that we all have to deal with, and can't. It's unsafe. It's dangerous. It's of another level. So I'm curious, you have like the whole UN of experience that you're bringing, your years in it. Any feedback on that really challenging issue?
Yes, thank you, Christina. And Amazon Aid Foundation, I'm also very honored to serve on their board, and they're doing phenomenal work. It's a matter of basically thinking about it in terms of with corruption overall. You have to first of all ask yourself, with initiatives like EITI, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which was set up to deal with corruption. The goal needs to be development ultimately, and transparency and anti-corruption efforts are a means to an end towards that ultimately, right? So I think we need to figure out a way by which you navigate the corruption issue, keeping that ultimate goal in mind. If corruption is clearly being an impediment to development, it needs to be rooted out immediately. But there is going to be always some level of attrition with this kind of situation, whether it is, people call it facilitation payments or other kinds of mechanisms. There has to be some recognition of, well, how do you figure out a way to deal with that inequality that is leading to corruption? And, in Pakistan, I'll give you an example. We have had a huge problem with police corruption, where people are bribing police officers when they get speeding tickets. You don't that doesn't happen here, but it happens in a lot of other parts of the world. Now, when they built a major motorway between Lahore and Islamabad, the capital and the second largest city, one of the things that the idea they had was that they established a special police force for that motorway. And these people were paid 5 times more than what the regular police officers were paid. And they saw an immediate decline in the problem of these payments. I mean, they actually started giving people prizes for, like how many people were, and you saw the incentive mechanisms change. So the core problem is the inequality. The core problem is dealing with that, and then you will see. Now, you will still have white-collar corruption. There are people who are, who have this avarice, which is, completely insatiable. But at least it will be diminished to some degree. So I think we need to focus much more on that global inequality problem. I do feel that will help us with corruption also. And the corruption part, there will be a process. Ultimate goal will be should be the development metrics. The UN is doing a lot on corruption. I mean, there's a lot of corruption within the UN system that was identified, as you well know. Much more in terms of independent evaluation mechanisms. Like the World Bank has its own independent evaluation office. Even the Global Environment Facility, which is the largest multilateral trust fund to support environmental projects, there's a separate independent evaluation office, especially to deal with corruption, to figure out, like, are the projects having an impact? And they have a staff of 20 people who work on just that. They're trying to, but it's going to be a long struggle, and there's no doubt about it. I mean, simple things like per diems. A lot of people from developing countries, they want to come for conferences because that's a lot of their livelihood, is they make it their per diem they get, and they'll go and, basically scrounge on food so they can just keep the per diem. This is a very common occurrence all over the developing world. I wouldn't call that corruption. It's okay, They're given an allowance, and if they want to figure out how to do it, So these kinds of, we have to be a little bit adaptive also.
I think we're coming back to a high tide lifts all boats.
Well, yes, ultimately, but the inequality has to be there, because you could still have the tide lifting and the inequality growing, which is what has happened in many parts of the world, is that you have had growth, but you have still had the top 1% are still controlling far more. And that's not to go into, I mean, in the US, of course, socialism and all, people start stigmatizing it. I say, look, I am a capitalist, but I'm a constructive capitalist. The big problem we have is the notion of capitalism has been corrupted. One of the golden rules of capitalism is people respond to incentives, right? A simple rule, which makes a lot of sense. I'm all for it. when you create huge inequality, you distort incentives. If you have CEOs whose severance package is more than most of us will make in a lifetime. Severance package, keep in mind. To be fired for not doing a good job, you will get, I mean, this was Michael Ovitz, I think the CFO of Sydney, his severance package was like $95 million. How on earth is that capitalism? Because it's defying the golden rule of capitalism that people respond to incentives. If you're going to be given that money to be fired for doing a bad job, it makes no sense to me. That's not capitalism. It's a
But it is-
corruption of capitalism, and that's the kind of thing we have to deal with, you know. So.